Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Christian Tagsold teaches in the Department of Modern Japan at Heinrich Heine University of Dusseldorf. He's been researching Japanese gardens since 2006. He originally studied cultural sociology, but research into the Japanese educational system led him to an interest in Zen Buddhism's appeal to the West, and thus to Zen gardens. And finally, he realized he was more interested in the gardens than he was in Zen. So we are going to benefit from this interest in this evening's talks. So welcome, Christian, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks very much for the nice introduction. And yeah, so as you said, I've been researching Japanese gardens since 2006. And in 2012, I was actually going to Japan for doing some final archival research for my book, Spaces in Translation, Japanese Garden in the West. So I was in Tokyo, and for a change, I wanted to visit some lesser known Japanese gardens in Japan, and decided to go for the Tonovayato Garden in Kokubunji, which is a city in Tokyo Prefecture, but actually basically a part of the megapolis. The garden was one I never had seen before, and I found some curious stuff on the internet about this garden. So it had been built in the 1920s, and in the internet there were contradictory assessments. Kokubunji city's homepage spoke of and I quote, West-East eclectic stroll garden, end of quote. So it's eclectic for Kokubunji city. While other sites claimed it was a traditional Japanese garden, which made me very much wonder what it was all about. Is it eclectic or traditional? I didn't know. So the garden is located conveniently next to Kokubunji main station. And for a garden, it is rather large and more feels like a park. The Tonogayato was most beautiful on the day I went, but its history was even more appealing to me and added a new perspective to my research plans. On the side, it dawned to me why this garden was categorized as eclectic by some and traditional Japanese by others. The little museum at the Tonogayato helped to carve out this story. In the 1920s, the garden looked somewhat too modern to be Japanese. Hence, it was categorized as eclectic. However, in the 1960s, it was nearly scrapped for building a shopping mall close to the station. The citizens' movement luckily was able to stop these plans. But the movement first still did not see the garden as traditional Japanese. They wanted to save it for preserving nature for the city of Kokubunji. So they didn't very much think about it being Japanese. For them, it was something about environment and having more green around in Kokubunji. Only in the 1970s, they started arguing for its cultural value as Japanese tradition. And finally, in 2011, the Tonogayato was listed as national heritage. And this day at the Tonogayato for me was a starting point for a new project. In my book, Spaces in Translation, I had asked how the category Japanese garden has been construed by a process of mutual cultural translation in the late 19th century. Japan had a very rich and diverse garden culture up to the point when restrictions in dealing with the West were removed around the 1850s. The shogun's capital, Edo, this is today's Tokyo, was a green city as each domainal lord kept residences there adorned with gardens. And you can see that on this map I've been showing to you. In the background, it's the Fuji you can see. And in the foreground, you can see a lot of green and some ponds. Also to the right and to the upper left, there's a lot of green. So these are the so-called daimyo gardens, the gardens of the domainal lords. With about 300 daimyo, as the lords were called, we have all in all about 900 gardens in Edo at that time, because each of the daimyo possessed about 3 residences, each adorned with a garden. And the residences looked like this. And this is one of the central residences. So it's not a huge garden here, which you can see in the middle, but some of the gardens were really huge and extensive. However, with the end of the so-called Edo period in 1868, named after the capital, the daimyo did not need these gardens anymore, while the growing city needed building land. So in the 1880s and 90s, most of the gardens were scrapped, not so different from the 1960s when Tonovayato was in danger. The rich tradition of daimyo gardens was cut off, and only a handful of them remain today in Tokyo. After opening up to the West, the rich horticulture was reduced to an archetypical style, mostly represented by classic Kyoto gardens. And this style was rendered into the Japanese garden, mainly through exhibiting it at world's fairs, and thus turned into a national Japanese symbol. Now I've cut, and here you can see, this is the World's Fair at Vienna, 1873, and it's a very famous etching because the Austrian Empress Elisabeth Sissi is very dear to Germans' hearts due to television movies in the 1950s. So everybody knows her. But you can see it was a very crowded garden with huge lanterns and stuff like that. And you can also see that at the World Fairs, it was pretty puzzling for visitors because everything went into each other. To the back, you see the palace of the wise king of Egypt. So it was Egypt, Japan all at once. Now I've cut a long and intricate story very short here because today I don't want to talk about Japanese gardens in the West. Instead, I want to focus on the renaissance of horticulture starting in the 1890s in Japan and its meaning for understanding the category Japanese gardens in Japan. As I will show, gardens like the Tonogayato pose some problems to the evolution of academic horticultural theory and history. They did not resemble Kyoto gardens close enough to add them to the canon of Japanese gardens. And this canon was only formed in the 1860s, 1870s, as I've already said, and as I'll further show. Thus, at some point, professors and pundits went for the label eclectic to deal with the gardens built around 1890s, 1900. However, in the last 3 decades, this assessment has been reversed, and now many of these gardens are indeed included in the canon of Japanese gardens, and even more enlisted as national heritage as such. And this process proves the dynamism of the very category Japanese gardens. So after going to Tonogayato in 2012, I started to apply for grants. And from 2016 to 2018 was able to secure funds from the German Research Foundation to look closer into the shift of meaning of these gardens. And with the help of a postdoc, Niels, whom you can see here on the right side, we looked into many archives to research how such gardens were built in between the 1890s and 1920s. Next, we asked how they survived after World War II, when many of their original owners had lost their means to sustain these gardens or simply lost interest. Many of the gardens were converted into public parks, while others perished. Finally, we conducted interviews with heritage bureaucrats, specialists in the fields, and garden administrators, like in this case on the left, to find out how these sites lately have been turned into national heritage and what this new status entails. So in my presentation today, I will first show how and why the new gardens came into being in the first place, who commissioned them and to what end. In the next parts, I will discuss how garden experts discussed these sites and why they were labeled as eclectic. And in the third and last part, I will talk about the fate of these gardens after their social context broke down with Japan's defeat in World War II. Just as in the case of the daimyo gardens after the end of the Edo period, the shogunate, owners lost their interest in these gardens. Many gardens were saved, however, by turning them into public parks. However, since the 1990s, garden experts and citizens developed a new interest in these gardens, coupled with a new interpretation of their quality as Japanese gardens, at least in some cases. Overall, the story, however, is much more complex, as I will show in there. Okay, so let's move towards the gardens and see how they were built in the first place. Up to the 1850s, the shogunate ruling Japan had a very strict policy regarding the West. Only the Dutch were allowed to trade with the country, as they were Protestant and thus not so much interested in mission. So the Japanese, the shogun, was most of all afraid that the Portuguese and Spanish who entered Japan first would turn it into a Catholic country, and that would cause all sorts of problems. But Japan was not completely secluded, as information entered the country via the Dutch and the Chinese, and global trade was quite extensive. Still, when the American president sent Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853-54 to negotiate a treaty for opening up ports and trade, this sent a shockwave throughout Japan. Young samurai wanted to expel the red-haired and long-nosed barbarians. That's how they saw us. Maybe in my case, it's even true because I'm sort of red-haired. And these young samurais scolded the shogunate for not sticking to the policy of strictly controlling contact with the West. In 1868, this political crisis led to the so-called Meiji Restoration. And the Edo period came to an end. And it's called Meiji Restoration because the Tenno who came back into power, or whose power was restored in 1868, is the Meiji Tenno, and his name was used for the whole era. The young samurai had set up a kind of regional movement which forced the shogun to abdicate. In his place, the emperor, who had for over 200 years resided in Kyoto as some sort of political, less relevant religious leader, was pushed to the political limelight. He moved to Tokyo, the former capital of the shogunate, and it's at that time it was still Edo, but they renamed it Tokyo, meaning capital of the East. The young samurai, now practically ruling in Japan, soon understood, however, that expelling the West was not possible anymore and radically changed their policies. Instead, they instigated a program of rapid modernization along Western lines. And for horticulture, this meant the end of an era, as I have already indicated. Garden masters all over the country faced a hard time since the patrons who had sustained their art by now had lost their power and also did not need extended gardens anymore. Only by the 1890s, that is 20 years after Meiji Restoration, the garden business did settle to some degree again. At that point, some of the young samurai had turned into elder statesmen and exceedingly rich leaders of business conglomerates called saibats in Japan. Now, this fresh ruling class had ample means for presenting their taste and cultural habitus to the world and their colleagues. And some of the former samurai indulged into tea ceremony, some collected art, and some, as we will see, began creating gardens. And coming to all these activities was a taste for some sort of tradition, coupled, however, with a modern twist. The former samurai by the 1890s had learned to cherish Western modernity, but at the same time felt the need to create some Japanese identity, which helped to avoid being fully soaked up by this very Western modernity. On a state level, many traditions were invented to foster patriotism and make sure that Western influence did not overcome a sense of being Japanese. So let's see how this played out at the level of gardens. And this is my first major example. It is called Murin-an in Kyoto. And this is a garden Luke has already introduced in his very stimulating presentation 2 weeks ago. Murin-an was commissioned by Yamagata Aritomo, a very typical proponent of the Meiji Restoration. Yamagata had worked hard towards overthrowing the shogunate and reinstalling the emperor. And as a reward, he became one of the leading politicians and army generals of his times. Gifted with a soldier's mind, he helped to defeat the Chinese army in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. The first crucial step for the country for becoming an imperial power of its own. For this loyal service as general of one of the armies during this war, the emperor gave Yamagata a considerable sum of money as reward. And Yamagata used this money to buy up a lot of land in Okazaki in Kyoto. Okazaki had been former temple's grounds to the east of the old capital. At the end of the 19th century, it became a highly fashionable and a very modern quarter. Most of all, the fourth National Industrial Exhibition was held in Okazaki, a small Japanese World's Fair in a sense. In addition, many new institutions such as art museum, Western style theaters, the zoo of Kyoto and libraries were built in Okazaki, and Okazaki was connected to the city by a new tramway, a new FET in the 1890s. In Okazaki, the city of Kyoto tried to become modern. In addition, one of the most prestigious infrastructural projects of the era in Japan progressed in Okazaki. A canal was built between Lake Biwa, the largest lake in Japan, and Kyoto. And Lake Biwa is roughly like 25 miles away from Kyoto. So it was not so easy to build the canal because in between Lake Biwa and Kyoto, it's only hills, and they had to dig long tunnels to get the water in the canal into Kyoto. Initially, the water flowing into Kyoto should have driven machines at factories in Okazaki. However, when the canal was finished, electricity had succeeded water power. But the canal was still very meaningful for connecting Kyoto to the hinterland to transport food from the fields into the city. So the canal, this is a small part of the canal actually. It's a little bit broader. This is only one branch of the canal, and they used it to ship food into Kyoto, but also stones for gardens, as you will see in a second. So the canal, even though it did not drive machines at factories, was still very useful. And was also very useful for showing to the world that Kyoto was a modern city. Moreover, the Lake Biwa canal also gave rise to a new garden culture in Kyoto. Instead of factories, many estates now were built in Okazaki by the new elites and adorned with gardens. But Kyoto is sparse of water since it is not on the seaside. At times, pebbles and stones had been used to symbolize water in gardens to make up for this water shortage. So the most famous garden in Kyoto, the Ryo-Anji, this famous stone garden, that's because it's so hard to have a lot of water in Kyoto. It's a very dry city, actually. Now, however, in Okazaki, they had the Lake Biwa canal, and gardeners branched off water from the canal on the pretext of fire prevention. So everybody knew that the water wasn't for fire prevention, but they needed to say this to the city of Kyoto to be able to branch off water. Otherwise, it would have been sort of problematic. However, since it was the elites building gardens like Yamagata Aritomo, nobody did say a word about that. So one of the gardeners, Ogavajihi, became famous for creating gentle streams and the trickling sound of water in his gardens. And I'll talk about Ogavajihi a lot because the story of the gardens of 1900, 1910, 1920 very much revolves around him. And he's key to understanding why these gardens went from being dubbed as eclectic to traditional Japanese. So the first major project for Ogavajihi was Murin-an, which you can see here again, commissioned by Yamagata Aritomo. And you can see how Ogavajihi used the water at Murin-an. This is all water of the Lake Biwa canal. So Murin-an basically relies on a very, very modern feature of Kyoto, a new canal built with modern machinery and so on. And thus, Murin-an wouldn't have been possible in the Edo era or before. And actually, Murin-an indeed was very much different from classical, highly symbolic Kyoto gardens. It looked much more natural in the sense that stones or lanterns did not symbolize a grand Buddhist scheme or allude to some old poem, as they did in classical gardens. Yamagata had wanted to look his garden fresh and modern while still being rooted in Japanese garden tradition. In that way, Yamagata could show his visitors his political convictions through horticulture. So he wanted to know, he wanted all his visitors to know that he was a man of Japanese culture, but also a modern politician, being able to create something different. Unlike the temple gardens in Kyoto, his garden, Murin-an had wide lawns, which you can't see that good here. I can see it here a bit. Maybe I've picked the wrong pictures, but believe me, there's a huge lawn here. In general, lawns were a prerequisite in these types of gardens because the owners at times had to stage parties and needed the space to do so. So Yamagata used Murin-an not just as a garden to drink tea or whatever, but also as a site to together with other politicians and socializing, stuff like that, what politicians do. Most garden historians actually have glossed over the social function of the new gardens. But Yamagata's Murin-an was no place of pure art for his contemporaries. It was a space where political decisions were made. The Kyoto newspapers reported regularly that Yamagata stayed in town in Murin-an, pondering over politics. And one great example of this is this caricature from the late 1890s. Here we see Yamagata in the garden on the porch, and we know that it is Murin-an because it's written in kanji to his back, even so it's not easy to read kanji, but in the 1890s people understood. And Yamagata is thinking about a colonial project, a new railway in China Japan wanted to build at that time. So Murin-an not only was by its origin clearly linked to imperialism, and everybody knew, because Yamagata had built the garden on a gift by the emperor for his bravery in war against China. But it was also linked in people's minds through newspaper caricatures like this, and by knowing that Yamagata was doing politics at the garden. This was not a space of pure art. It was much more for everybody. Besides Yamagata's Murin-an, we see here the other gardens built by Ogavajihi in Okazaki. So this is a plan of Okazaki. And to the right side, you see the grid of a former temple, which had to sell off its land after Meiji Restoration to generate income, since Buddhism wasn't that central for the Meiji government anymore as it was in the Edo era. And the elites bought up this land to build their gardens. And number one is Murin-an, and it's next to the zoo. And you can also see the canal running nearby and the different branches of the canal next to the gardens and feeding them with water. On the upper left, you see another huge project by Ogavajihi, the Chimod shrine for the 1895 industrial exhibition. And Ogavajihi was commissioned with building the gardens around the shrine. So it's for the Chimuteno, this is the shrine. After planning Murin-an, Ogavajihi became a very sought of after landscape designer, first in Kyoto and then all over Japan. Because of course, obviously, Yamagata Aritomo was very well connected to everybody, and having been a gardener for Yamagata Aritomo helped to get more commissions all over the place. Ogavajihi's fame, however, was not only derived from his style or for having worked for Yamagata Aritomo. He also executed his plans very cleverly, that is, cheap. Ogawa used modern machines and made best use of the canal. Not only did he branch off the water, the canal helped to bring in stones from the hinterland and at a reasonable price. So all in all, Ogawa was not simply a landscape designer, as one scholar has remarked, but more of a producer of these new gardens, which broke with Kyoto's garden tradition. And that helped to bring in more commissions. Now, however, gardens like the Murin-an and others by Ogavajihi in Okazaki, or also new gardens in Tokyo, met with curiosity and certain problems to interpret them. Kureda Tengai, a journalist who wrote about scenic places in Kyoto, assessed the Murin-an with the words, and I quote him, "In some way, there is a natural atmosphere that is different from other gardens. It is a garden that is in a class of its own," end of quote. We are used to see Japanese gardens as perfect expressions of nature. However, this link is rather new. Up to the 19th century, gardens were either about Buddhism, Buddhist worldviews, or about cleverly referring to literature and scenic spots far away as some sort of aristocrat game. In Kurada's assessment, nature is used in a modern semantic, denoting pureness and absence of human culture, a concept which entered Japan through the West. Soon enough, however, gardens like the Murin-an or the Tonovayato were excluded from the canon of Japanese gardens. In the 1910s, landscape architecture and garden history began to establish itself as a subject at Japanese universities. Before, this had been the realm of practitioners who, however, had not worked on history through sources in a modern scientific way. Yokoi Tokifuyo, mainly known as an economic historian today, was the first to write a history of Japanese gardens in 1892. And it's one of the images from his book showing a garden from the Heian period, that is the 11th century. So Tokifuyo really wrote about Japanese gardens as a whole. He did the full history. His time and storyline is interesting because it anticipated typical patterns of explaining Japanese garden history. Yokoi linked garden history in Japan to established epochs, such as the Edo period from 1600 to 1868. So he discussed mainly Heian gardens, one epoch, or Edo gardens. He gave a chapter to each of these epochs. First, gardens were categorized according to these epochs and not according to stylistic developments of their own. And second, Yokoi did not assume that styles changed that much anyway. While European art history is often narrated as a sequence of stylistic revolutions, or at least ruptures, caused by ingenious individual artists, Japanese gardens did for Yokoi did not significantly change their outlook. A garden from the 9th century was based on the same principle as ones from the 15th century, all Japanese gardens. This tendency to essentialize Japanese gardens makes a lot of sense if we look at it in historic context. Japanese gardens were able to anchor some sort of national identity. Whatever the outside world did to Japan, China exporting its culture to Japan up to the 19th century, or the West modernizing the country since then, at least gardens stayed the same. And this was also a part of the Japanese government strategy of presenting the country to the West. Gardens were part of nearly all pavilions at World's Fairs, where they were promoted as the essence of Japanese culture and aesthetics. In the 1920s and 30s, Japanese garden history professionalized, and the scholars went along Yokoi's lines. They established a timeline for Japanese garden history and worked on archival sources. While their paradigms basically were derived from European art history, the garden experts tried to close off their sujet from the intrusion of Western intellectuals. Authors like Sato Akira argued that no Westerners could grasp the essence of Japanese gardens, regardless how hard they tried. Since the 1890s, Western experts had published many books and papers on Japanese gardens, like Josiah Konda's Landscape Gardening in Japan being the most famous. What Konda did in his book, you can see a little bit of what Konda did in his book. He was kind of introducing all elements of Japanese gardens on their own, building families and generi and stuff like that, very much in a Linnean way. Konda had been hired by the Japanese government to teach Western architecture at the Tokyo Imperial University and had become interested in landscapes. His book was very influential in the West, but now the new generation in Japan tried to underline his shortcomings. And they did not want to have an Englishman define Japanese gardens anymore. The Japanese discourse revolved around fanning of Western influence and defined Japanese gardens as a realm beyond the grasp of Western Orientalism. And this was an anti-colonial strategic move, which however quickly evolved into an ultra-nationalist underpinning of Japanese colonialism in Asia. This notion of an essentialized Japanese garden expressing the very core of national identity and being unintelligible for foreigners had consequences for the status of gardens like the Murin-an or the Tonogayato. Japanese garden historians shunned them for being not authentically Japanese enough. Kyoto's imperial and Buddhist sites perfectly expressed Japanese horticulture in their eyes. Ogavajihi did not. And this is one of the most famous gardens, which completely fulfill the needs of the ultra-nationalist fascist garden historians in the 1930s. This is a Katsura, imperial villa in Kyoto, which was built in the early 17th century. And by that time was touted as one of the key gardens of Japanese garden history. And by the way, neither did daimyo gardens in former Edo, now Tokyo, from the period of the shogunate qualify as perfect Japanese gardens for the experts in the 1930s and 40s. The experts deemed them as too flashy, not symbolical enough, and also disliked the wide lawns, which the local lords had needed to stage parties when attending the shogun in Edo. A good example of Ogavajihi's reception in this era can be found in Shigemori Mire's work. Shigemori had originally been educated in traditional Japanese painting, but his interest in gardens and network acumen led him to compile a vast encyclopedia of historic Japanese gardens within just 3 years. Nihon Tenji Zukan, Illustrated Japanese Garden History, appeared in 1936 and spanned over 24 volumes and treated hundreds of gardens from every epoch. So it basically became the one encyclopedia which you looked at if you wanted to know something about whatever garden in Japan. In the last 4 volumes, excluding the supplementary volumes, Shigemori elaborated on gardens in the Meiji era, that is 1868 to 1912, Taisho era, 1912 to 1926, and the Showa period from 1926 up to 1989, which he obviously didn't know in 1936. So he included examples from the very recent past, even from the last 10 years, that is the Showa period. Shigemori's treatment of the Murin-an betrays his view of Ogawa's garden in the context of a general garden history very well. As with each garden he included in his encyclopedia, Shigemori gave a detailed account of its history, patron, and garden master before moving on to assess its style in categories he himself had set up. For the Murin-an, Shigemori set out to judge Yamagata and Ogawa's respective shares in the garden design. And he came to the conclusion that Ogawa must have lacked experience at such an early point in his career. And it was up to Yamagata to guide and educate him. Shigemori's discussion, however, seems to be biased. He overemphasized Yamagata's contribution to the garden style because Yamagata was one of the Meiji period's foundational statesmen, and his heroic commitment to the cause of the emperor and the new state perfectly matched the patriotic feelings of the 1930s. Overall, Shigemori more than once terms Murin-an modern, which implicitly excluded it from the traditional canon of Japanese gardens. So by the end of the 1930s, Ogavajihi gardens simply were deemed to be eclectic, not Japanese, too modern, using modern Western technique to build them, and somehow not what gardens in Kyoto looked like usually. However, after the end of World War II, the gardens I talk about faced an entirely new phase, and that's the third part of my talk. The social context which had brought them into existence and sustained them was gone. The US occupational forces untangled the huge conglomerates called Seibats, and the old elites lost some of their power and wealth. Most of all, their need for large gardens as a token of social, economic, and cultural influence disappeared. The new era was democratic, and even though the former elite circles remained powerful to some degree, large gardens were turned into building land, a fate akin to that of the hundreds of daimyo gardens of the Meiji Restoration. Let me shortly introduce 2 examples to show how some of the gardens survived anyway. The former Furukawa gardens were laid out by Yosaya Kone and Ogavajihi for the Seibats family Furukawa, and you see here the Japanese part of the garden built by Ogavajihi. The money which built this lovely site in Tokyo was incredibly dirty. The Furukawa owned the largest copper mine in Japan, which around 1900 polluted the surrounding farming land and killed many farmers and their families. However, in Tokyo, the Furukawa estate served as a green oasis in a rather industrial ward. When the Furukawa Zaibatsu was dissolved, the family had some cash flow problems and had to hand over the estate to the tax authorities at the end of the 1940s. First, tax authorities wanted to demolish the gardens and sell off the land, as they are actually required by law. But then the local housewives committee jumped in, and the housewives committee in Japan is a very powerful feminist organization throughout the whole country. They demanded to convert the gardens into a public park, less so because of its historic value, but for the benefit of families and children. And so Tokyo Prefecture bought up the estate in the mid-1950s and established indeed a public park. Only in the 1990s, the Furukawa Gardens would once again be valued as historical gardens. The story of the Tonovayato Garden, here to the lower right, and you can see how close it is to the station of Kokubunji, is very similar. As I learned in the little museum on site, Tonogayato's convenient location had nearly sealed its fate in the 1960s. The garden belonged to the Iwasaki family, the owners of Mitsubishi, and thus one of the most wealthy families in the country before and after the war. However, in the late 1960s, Iwasaki Hikoyata, its owner, died, and the family wanted to sell the lot. The local economy was more than happy to propose building a shopping mall next to the station, and local politicians went along with that plan. Quickly, however, and luckily, a citizens' movement formed to save the Tonovayato. Many famous writers, actors, and professors lived nearby who petitioned the city and prefecture. And when I later read about their struggle in a book on the Tonovayato, the movement's arguments were totally fascinating. The movement underlined the garden's value for its environment and recreation, but did not once touch on its potential status as cultural heritage. Only when Tokyo Prefecture had saved the garden in the early 1970s, responding to the movement demands, suddenly the Tonovayato was addressed as a Japanese garden, and the movement had concrete replaced with traditional-looking elements, such as stone pavements. So this is not original in Tonovayato Garden, but the movement to save the garden wanted to have such a path to make the garden look more traditionally Japanese. So you could say that in the 1970s, the Tonovayato for the first time got really traditional Japanese, more so than it ever had been before. But still, just like in the case of the Furukawa Gardens, turning Tonovayato into a national heritage site was far away. Gardens like this needed one more booster to make it on the list. An important factor that helped bring the gardens from the Meiji and Taisho eras into the limelight again has been the fascination with Ogavajihi in the recent decades. In the 1980s, historians from various fields started re-evaluating Ogavajihi, the garden master from Kyoto. This created widespread interest in his oeuvre and has eventually triggered some experts' interest in protecting the gardens. Indeed, Ogava's recent ascent to fame has been so overwhelming that some have lamented how he now overshadows other modern gardens, and thus how his rediscovery has been a double-edged sword for the reception of the period. So if it's an Ogawa garden, it's by now famous and important and will be national heritage. If it's not, well, too bad for it. But how did Ogawa turn into a garden historical celebrity? It was not until the 1980s that Ogawa started attracting more scholarly attention. And two main developments simultaneously led to this reappraisal. First, local garden historians in Kyoto started studying Ogawa. Second, the interest from architectural historian Suzuki Hiroyuki helped to lend a more general impetus to the interest in modern garden history. These two developments were accompanied by a general shift in Japanese garden history that led to an increasingly complex and balanced appreciation of Edo gardens and their influence on Meiji and Taisho gardens. The local reappreciation of Ogawa is largely connected with Amasaki Hiromasa. In the late 1980s, Amasaki pushed to establish a study group on garden history at Kyoto Art University, where he had been employed and later became a full professor. He brought together a group of students who eventually decided to continue researching Ogawa, since classic garden masters from the late 16th and early 17th century had been already studied in depth and were well known. While Amasaki promoted Ogawa in Kyoto and helped generate local interest in him, architecture historian Suzuki Hiroyuki from the University of Tokyo arrived at the garden master through his initial interest in Yamakata Arito, the patron of Murinan. For Suzuki, Ogawa linked the Meiji era to the Showa era in terms of garden style. And the Showa era, that's the era spanning through most of the 20th century, from 1926 to 1989. And Meiji is 1868 to 1912. In Suzuki's word, Ogawa was, and I quote him, keeper of modern Japanese culture taking place in Kyoto, end of quote. Suzuki suggested that the gardener created his oeuvre within the framework of Japanese tradition, but still was modern. Amasaki and Suzuki published a couple of books at major publishers, that's here, which considerably helped to raise interest in Ogavajihi. And, oops, here, around 2000, this spread into television, and Ogawa started to get featured in national TV documentaries as a traditional yet modern Japanese garden master, and his landscape drew more and more tourists. So this is a documentary by NHK, the BBC of Japan, the state television, and it shows, and this is why I chose this picture, because it looks so funny, how the stones for Murinan were carried through Okazaki after leaving the Lake Biwa Canal. So this is a typical documentary which by now introduces Ogavajihi to all of Japan via television. As Ogawa's reputation exploded during the next 2 or 3 decades after Suzuki and Amasaki started publishing on him, there was another general trend in garden history that ensured his status. Suzuki had pointed out that open lawns were a typical element of Ogawa designs and delineated how the garden master was able to overcome the feeling of tension typical of the classic narrow, symbolically charged gardens of Kyoto. But Shirahato Yosaburo, professor at the International Research Center for Japanese Studies, Nichibunken in Kyoto, and this is a beacon of studying traditional Japanese arts, harnessed the lance to a further interpretation of Ogawa's link to Japanese garden tradition. In his book Daimyo Teien, Daimyo Gardens from 1997, Shirahata set out to rehabilitate these gardens. So the Daimyo Gardens, once again, are the ones built in the Edo period, 1600 to 1868. And were very much in low esteem among garden historians of the 1930s, 40s. But among other typical characteristics of daimyo gardens, Shirahata highlighted the open vistas created through lawns. And you see that very much here, there's a lot of open lawns in this garden in Tokyo. The lawn not merely enabled visual openness, it also saved as a space for feudal festivities. Shirahata, however, did not end his story with the rapid disappearance of daimyo gardens in modern Japan. Instead, he connected his observations to Ogavajihi, and I quote Shirahata, often counted among the greatest masterpieces of Japanese garden designs, Ogawa's gardens were the heirs to the daimyo garden tradition, end of quote. And Shirahata's statement had deeper implications than just contributing to Ogawa's renewed fame. For Shirahata in his book Daimyo Gardens, Ogawa was not someone who sacrificed old Japanese horticulture in order to bring Western ideas into landscaping, but someone who actually preserved it by means of continuing the style of Daimyo Gardens. We can even further generalize here and link the history of gardens to a wider trend in Japanese appreciation of history. Since the 1980s, the Edo period has become highly fashionable. History is big business in Japan, as many Japanese love to read historical books and consume TV series on their past. And for a long time, historians, intellectuals, and the public disdained the Edo period and the rule of the shogun as the dark ages of Japanese history. In an ultra-nationalist reading of the 1930s and 40s, the shogun had usurped the political power rightfully belonging to the emperor, and thus was totally wrong and problematic in itself. And the Edo period, therefore, was dark times for Japan. In addition, scholars argued that secluding Japan from the world hindered developing the country. However, the economic success of the 1970s and 80s, when Japan rose to one of the global powerhouses, changed views. Now everybody looked for Japanese roots of the economic miracle. Companies and their employees were compared to feudal clans and their samurai willing to sacrifice themselves for the common good. And this really was a big thing also in the West. Everybody wanted to know how the Japanese had been able to outdo Britain, Germany, whoever, and why they were starting to flood all the world with new goods, cars, and so on. And the answer to this riddle, they thought, must be found in the Edo period. At the same time, historians argued that Japan was not so much secluded after all in the Edo period. Actually, seeds for an Eastern modernity were sown in this period. Indeed, outside contact and export made up for about 10% of the gross domestic product, a considerable percentage for the 17th and 18th century. In addition, during the Edo period, Japan began to form an integrated economy on the national scale, with cash crop and other products moving all around the country. Adding gardens to the picture made a lot of sense and bolstered the general argument one more time. And in that sense, Shirahata cleverly rode the wave of this Edo boom, which very, very much broke off in the 1980s, 1990s, when everybody was high on Edo and wanted to explain why the real Japan had its rule in Edo. All of this had very much consequences for heritage politics. By the 1950s, and this is a map of all heritage gardens at a given time, and here it's in 1955, and to the left, you see the period. So the blue squares are gardens before the Edo period, so before 1600. The green ones are national heritage gardens in the Edo period. And the orange is Meiji, 1860s to 1912. The brown is Taisho, and you can't see any here except one lozenge, one diamond to the right side. Is Taisho 1912 to 1926, and Showa is 1926 to 1989. There's one Showa garden actually already being heritage in national heritage in the 1955. However, by 1950s, not surprisingly, gardens built around 1900 had still not been included into heritage, with a few exceptions. And these included Murin-an, less so because of the garden itself, but because of its connection to the famous statesman Yamagata Aritomo. The vast majority of heritage gardens stemmed from the Edo period, that's the green ones, or earlier, because the Edo gardens often were included in their function as public space, and besides, pre-Edo gardens are rare anyway. So Edo gardens are among the oldest existing gardens in Japan, and therefore an obvious choice for heritage. Kyoto and adjacent Shiga Prefecture were the centers of heritage horticulture, and that's why I moved Kyoto and Shiga upwards. Shiga is the red prefecture in here, and Kyoto is here in blue, and I had to move it up because it's too small to fit in all the national heritage gardens. by the 1980s, 70s, the picture still hadn't changed much. You see a couple of Meiji gardens all over the country, but the majority is still of national heritage gardens are still Edo and pre-Edo gardens, and it's still very much centered in Kyoto and Shiga. However, by 2000, heritage gardens first of all start to spread out, and you see a couple of Showa gardens and even Taisho gardens on the lower left, which by now have become national heritage. So they're slowly gaining ground. But by 2015, the pace had accelerated. Now heritage gardens are much more widely distributed over Japan. And it's a lot of Showa gardens, given that they are still not much older than 50 years usually. And it's a lot more Meiji gardens, most of them being from Ogavajihi, and also Taisho gardens. Still, most of course, Edo and pre-Edo, but if you compare it to before, it's the new ones are mostly, the newer periods. So you really can speak of a heritage boom also, which connects to the rising fame of Ogavajihi and in general to the new established garden history, which links up Edo as a new very important topic for Japanese garden history, which links up Edo period and Ogavajihi. So heritage in Japan entails Japaneseness to a large degree. Buildings and gardens, making of the West, for a long time were neglected. By now, their status has changed. With the idea of Japanese roots to Japanese modernity, it is much easier to create modern heritage. And it's also something you can see here in the map. So, to come to an end, I want to summarize the main findings of our research project once again. The first, most important for me, was to see to what degree the category Japanese gardens changed over time. First established in the second half of the 19th century, the notion of Japanese gardens excluded many instances of a rich horticulture in Japan. The category was quickly narrowed down to Kyoto gardens, and this sort of mirrors a general trend. Kyoto in the 20th century came to denote Japanese tradition, while Tokyo stands for modernity. Kyoto's highly modern side, Okazaki with all its new gardens, does not fit into this story. And the same goes for daimyo gardens of Tokyo. Only in the last decades, a new garden history has challenged these views. Second, the process of including gardens like Murin-an, Tonovayato, and others into the canon of Japanese gardens of traditional Japanese is intricate, and by no means straightforward. And I've not talked much about this, but I want to stress this point towards the end. Some of the gardens built around 1910, 1920 are still categorized as eclectic, like Count Okuma's garden at Waseda University, which you can see here. So this is a garden which very much looks at close look like an Ogawa garden, but wasn't built by Ogavajihi. And that's one of the reasons why the informational board at this garden still says it's an eclectic garden. This is less a matter of the garden's outlook and quality, but more so a result of contingent processes of reassessing heritage. So what is or what is not a Japanese garden to a certain degree is, contingent and heritage policies. Third, gardens are a fine example for discussing modernity and heritage in Japan. Heritage policies for a long time revolved around essentializing Japan and setting it apart from the West. Modern gardens and buildings did not fit into that strategy. However, lately a new sense of heritage has emerged, as well as a new understanding of modernity. By now, heritage specialists, historians, and public intellectuals try to reinterpret Japan as inherently modern since the shogunate's rule. Oops. Got a kill of somebody phoning me. Sorry for that. Should have turned that off. How can I do that? Okay. Wow. In the last seconds of my talk, that's bad luck. By now, heritage specialists, historians, and public intellectuals try to reinterpret Japan as inherently modern since the shogunate's rule. The confrontation with the West in this interpretation of history was just a trigger to unleash Japanese own modernity. And fourth and last, overall, the timeline of Japanese horticulture has changed fundamentally in the last 3 decades. Daimyo gardens are by now at the very core of this timeline, and as a consequence, Ogavajihi and the gardens of the modern periods have been elevated to the status of a traditional, Ogavajihi has been elevated to the status of a traditional garden master, and the gardens are seen as traditional Japanese. And Ogawa by now is seen as somebody who helped to unfold the potential of Japanese traditional gardens in the modern area. So I'm very curious to see how this whole process of creating heritage and rewriting Japanese garden history will further develop in the next years. But for today, let me just end here because I'm even more curious about your questions. And thanks for listening up to here.
Christian, thank you very much indeed for that summary of the attitudes to garden spaces changing through time. For me, at least, that was almost entirely new, and it raises interesting questions with such a different history about how those attitudes in our contexts have altered through time. Now will be the moment, everybody, if you've got a question, to put it on the chat box. We've got a number of minutes to raise the questions. And David asks first, who makes the decisions about heritage status, and are there set criteria?
Yeah, this is a very important question, which I obviously didn't touch upon in my presentation, so I should have done. So a key to national heritage in Japan is the Ministry of Education, and it's at least its former name. By now it's also research, and it's mixed, I think sport is included, but it's the Ministry of Education. And it's one of the most conservative ministries in Japan, and it has set up an agency for cultural matters, and this agency decides about national heritage. So usually owners have to apply for this status, but in the case of gardens, the agency in most cases contacts the owners first and tries to convince them that their garden needs to be national heritage. And there's a fixed set of heritage rules. And for gardens, this set doesn't include that the garden has to be historical. Gardens are mostly national heritage under the category of scenic spots. And this can be a modern garden also. But the cultural agency has a very clear and strict process of deciding which gardens and whatever can be national heritage and what not. However, they try to talk to the owners first and make sure that only owners apply when the garden more or less is secured national heritage status. Yeah. But it's a very conservative process, and the agency only lately has started to include modern gardens into the lists.
Thank you. Can I ask on the back of that?
Yeah.
Heritage is becoming quite political in the UK. Has there been any disputes about what's included and why it's included, or what categories it's included in?
Actually, there has been, because during the economic boom in the 1980s, many buildings from the around 1900, 1920s were scrapped in Tokyo, because Tokyo is ever so much hungry for building land. And architects very much were shocked about this and wanted the government to acknowledge that this can't go on forever. For example, Tokyo Station, you really should Google it. It's a fantastic building. Was nearly scrapped 3 decades ago. And that's one of the most important political moments for defining national heritage in Japan, which also has its repercussions in turning gardens into national heritage. So it's been a huge discussion, but only since the 1980s, I'd say.
That's interesting. Maybe a parallel there with St Pancras Station in London, which was
maybe.
Patience has asked, could you recommend further reading on the relation between nationalism and gardens in that nationalistic period between about 1930 and the end of the Second World War?
Not so easy, actually, unless you speak Japanese, which you probably don't. And it's been researched, but yeah, there's one guy, and I'm gonna put his name into the chat because he's Dutch and a very good colleague from mine from Leiden University. He's called Ubiquated, and so. And he's written a very good book at Penn Press 3 or 4 years ago, which is touching upon that relation. And also my talk today is actually derived from a manuscript I've handed into Brill and Leiden publisher, and maybe if it comes out, it will fulfill your needs in English.
Patience says thank you, and that she can't read Japanese.
Well, yeah.
Is there much acknowledgement? She's asked a supplementary question.
Yeah.
Is there much acknowledgement, or how much acknowledgement is there of the influence of, for example, China on the gardens themselves?
That's a very complicated topic once again, and it's very interesting because, for example, if you look at the official book for the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, the Japanese government was introducing its own garden there as a Chinese garden done in the way we Japanese would do it. So in the 1870s, they still acknowledged that China is behind all of that. But when the gardens became so successful and the Western public so much loved it, the Japanese governments quickly understood that advertising these gardens as Chinese wasn't that clever at all. All the more since China was touted as segment of Asia at that time, meaning that it had lost very much value in the eyes of the Westerners, and connecting one's own fate to China was not very clever. So garden historians in the 1920s and 1930s very much tried to undo any hints to Chinese influence on Japanese gardens. It was one of their main jobs, actually. So it's obvious Japanese gardens are very much influenced by Chinese gardens, but nobody does say that anymore. And that's one of, if you read Japanese books from 1920s, 1930s, it's all too obvious that they try to eradicate this sort of influence.
Yeah. Lynn has also asked a question and said that you've answered it, but I'm going to read the question in case you think there's anything else that's worth adding. It just doesn't matter if there isn't. She asked, the similarities of these gardens being used for power and politics has echoes of Stowe in the Midlands here, and of course Italian gardens of the Renaissance period and Versailles. It's fascinating to see the similarities. Do you have on where the greatest influence was from, particularly, she asked, during the pre-Meiji Restoration period?
Yeah, this is something Shirahata actually has pointed out in his book on daimyo gardens, which is been published in English, as you saw in my presentation, and it's for free on the homepage, on the Nichibunken homepage, so you can download the PDF over there. But the daimyo gardens were not really influenced by the West. So they did probably knew something about the West, but certainly not garden patterns. Actually, the influence is moving the other way around. So gardens like Kew Garden or so, and it's Kew with the pagoda and stuff like that, showed some Chinois influence, but not really being Chinese gardens in the 18th century. That's true. But the daimyo gardens were more or less answering to the needs of the daimyo. If you look closely at them, they may structurally and functionally look like Versailles, but if you look at the art and how they are presenting themselves, it's still very much different. But nevertheless, it's very interesting how power uses space and gardens to represent itself in the West and in the East. That's true.
Yeah. Yes. And with one more question from Agnes Esker. Thank you for your fascinating talk. Could you speak more about the trials and tribulations of researching gardens in Japan? Maybe the joys as well.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, we are a group of like 10 people in the West doing this and in a deconstructive way, and doing setting up a new history of Japanese gardens. And I always feel you need to know a lot of things. You need to speak Japanese fluently and read old sources. You need to have a sense of post-colonial theory, stuff like that, spatial turn. You need to know the plants and know how gardens are planted. You need to know like 5 or 6 things to do it perfectly. And I only can do 3 or 4 of them. I know nothing about plants. My good colleague and friend Wiebe Köthet, he's a gardener himself. He knows everything about plants, but he's not so good on in the part of post-colonial theory. So whenever I use terms like essentialize or culturalism, he's like, oops, what's that? That sounds interesting to me. And still we can talk very well to each other because we are doing the same things. So yeah, doing something like Japanese gardens, in the way we do it, ask a lot of researchers, and you can't do everything. And we simply have to admit that we have shortcomings and try to overcome them with teamwork and talking to our colleagues. And for the choice of doing gardens, when I did research on these gardens in Japan for about 1 month, I had my family along with me, and we visited 30 gardens. So it was per se 1 garden per day each. And my 5-year-old son, he was complaining to me, do we have to visit another garden today? Do we have to visit another one? And I told him, well, you're lucky. I could have researched prisons or homeless in Japan. And would you want to go to 30 prisons each day? So my son at one point understood that he was very much privileged seeing all these gardens, and all the Japanese bought him ice cream and whatever when he was in a Japanese garden, because he was a cute Western guy. And that's certainly one of the joys. It's fun hanging around in Japanese gardens. It's much better than a lot of other fields, which are important nonetheless, obviously.
Yes, there are worse things to research.
Definitely.
Patience has asked, could you tell us when your work is published? You mentioned one book which is already out.
So there is this book, Spaces in Translation, Japanese Gardens in Spaces and the West, Spaces in Translation, Japanese Gardens in the West. And this one is in English, and it's published with University of Pennsylvania Press, the Penn Studies in Landscape Architecture of John Dixon Hunt. So that's a book you can read and buy in English. And the upcoming book, hopefully, still under review, this is also English, and it will be the same title as today's presentation, and it's with Brill in Leiden. So this will be an English book too. And I've written a couple of papers on that, and I'm planning to write a couple of more. Some of them are unfortunately in German, but most of my work on garden actually is English. So you can take a look at my homepage. And forgot to include, oh my God, I forgot to include the last slide with all my credentials and who am I? So if you want to contact me, that's my email address. And if you want to look me up, I'm also doing stuff in English on Twitter, and at Twitter my handle is Briba. It's a German who went to America seeking the paradise. So if you look for Christian Tagsold on Twitter and look for a hashtag weekly JG, weekly Japanese garden, I've done a lot of garden portraits over there at Twitter for like a couple of months. I haven't done so lately because I had to finish my book manuscript. And to a certain extent, that was too much to me, talking about them on Twitter and doing a manuscript, handing it into Brill. But I think I've portrayed like 15, 20 gardens already on Twitter with this hashtag, the weekly Japanese garden, weekly JG.
Yeah. Thank you. And Patience has said thank you too. Juan has asked, thank you for your presentation. From research and on the idea of eclecticism, Jihi's work in Meiji times, Mere in Taisho, can any garden designer from the Showa era tell us how to keep a eclectic thought to understand the Japanese garden of the 21st century?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to be very careful about this eclectic or Japanese garden. This is sort of politics of horticulture. I don't think Ogawa's gardens are by any means perfectly described by calling them eclectic or not, or whatever they are. That's not. I'm not the one to decide. I'm only interested who says they're eclectic and who says they're traditional Japanese. So actually, Shigemori Mire's work is very much extending into the Showa period. He lived up to 1970, 1971 or something, and his son helped him to rewrite his Encyclopedia, which went into a reprint in, I think, 1972 or something, with even more culturalist assumptions. But there is one other Japanese, and I'm gonna type in here because Japanese names are sort of complicated, who is very interesting in that regard. Mori Osamu was very much one of the guys defining the Japanese gardens in the Showa period. And I should have said that before. All the Japanese names are in the Japanese order. So Mori is his family name, and Osamu the given name. And for Shigemori Mire, it's the same. Shigemori is his family name, and Ogawa is the family name of Ogavajihi.
Christian, thank you very much. I've stayed with that because there were obviously a number of questions and people were interested in it. But I'll hand back now to
all the questions.
Yeah. I'll hand back now to Michael Ann.
Thank you. There, I've done. Thank you very, very much, Christian, for a most enlightening talk and a lot to digest, I think.